Well, good morning, everybody. So we start now on the second day of our conference on innovations in development finance and the implications of those for governance, and conversely implications of governance for those innovations in development finance, and particularly as being hosted primarily by lawyers, there's a legal theme running through a lot of this, but as we saw yesterday, we're very much the intellectual aspiration of being cross-disciplinary and engaging a lot with people doing economics, development economics, political science, and the policy elements of those things. So that's been the flavour yesterday. There are several people newly here today who weren't able to be with us yesterday. So just as a short preface, this is hosted jointly by the Institute for International Law and Justice here at NYU. I'm the director of that, Benedict Kingsbury, and together with the Schumpeter group at the University of Gießen in Germany, headed by Philip Dunn, who's here with 4 of his doctoral students. So it's been really, for us, a really stimulating collaboration. At our end of it, the person primarily thinking in this area amongst our group present here is Kevin Davis. This was third of the organisers, and for us, the ILJ, this is really, it's at the intersection of 4 projects, this topic. Most obviously, Kevin Davis's project on financing development, which is focused a lot, especially on private aid flows, also trying to create financing development as a field of study with its legal and governance aspects, tied with its commercial law aspects. Second, this project we have on global administrative law, trying to look at how power is exercised beyond the state, and to some extent also at ways in which extra state sources of ideas of influence power funnel into the state and affect state and hybrid and private institutions within the state. So that's project's been going, I think, 8 years now. Probably has 250 papers or something like that in it, and from that project, but also other work of the ILJ, we have launched a book series recently with Oxford University Press called the Law and Global Governance series. The first book in that actually comes from a third ILJ project, which is about indicators and rankings in global governance. We have several people here who contributed to that. So that book came out last year with OUP, and for us, fourth project is one on interinstitutional relations and their effects on global governance, and also across and interstates, and that'll be the specific theme of this afternoon's workshop. So everyone here is utterly welcome to take part in that. It's a really round table format without pre-prepared papers at all, although with pre-prepared ideas, but it's really meant to be a kind of flow of ideas, very quick fire, sort of more TED style, insofar as any of us in the ancient world like me know what TED is, but so it'll be up on this floor in a round table format this afternoon from 2 until 5:40, and you can find the program up here printed out, and also I think on the internet now. So that's our 4 projects which kind of come together here. The second book in the OUP book series, the first one was from the Indicators Project, the second one is from the Governmental Law project more specifically, but it's edited by Michael Trabuco, who is here with Eleanor Fox in our NYU faculty on comparative competition institutions procedures. So it's really brought to light a whole, what turns out to be a highly exciting field, and a field really important in practice. And that book follows a really interesting, well-structured template as a comparative study, and I think it's going to have a lot of influence. So that's just published. The third book in the series is on the regulatory state, or the regulatory states of the South. And it focuses on developing countries' regulatory institutions in relation to electricity, telecommunications, and water in particular. It's a joint enterprise of Navros Dubash and the Centre for Policy Research, where Rani is now, and Bronwyn Morgan from Bristol now in Australia, with a team of primarily scholars from developing countries. And that's the second book in that series. There's a third project on comparative corruption and cross-border cooperation or not in corruption, which Kevin Davis has done with people in Richard Machado in FGV Sao Paulo, and Guillermo Jorge in Buenos Aires. They are now on a second round of that project. And there are series of more projects and all of that. And I say all that because one of the real inspirations and helps for all that has been David Malone, who I'm very pleased has been able to join us now. And I would introduce him as part of introducing the panel. But he wasn't here yesterday, so people won't have met him yet. David Malone was the Canadian representative in the Security Council from the government side, was then High Commissioner in India, helped host a joint conference. We had the ILJ with the Centre for Policy Research in Delhi, and then was back in Canada as head of the IDRC, and is now the Rector of the United Nations University, so just moved to Tokyo and New York and some other places, but he's been regularly and episodically an adjunct professor here at the law school. Rather amazingly, he fits that in with a focus on United Nations issues. So he's a real collaborator and friend, and it's really nice to be able to welcome David here. And he has, in particular, in this context of this conference, substantial experience now as a funder of development activities and an instigator of a number of them. So that's what he'll be bringing to this enterprise. For this morning, the structure of our panel is that there is a paper by Rosalind Shui together with Michael Nelson. And Rosalind was going to be here to present it, so we have the paper, but she's just got sick. Not badly, but enough that she couldn't come. So I'm going to briefly mention, in an appallingly crude way, some things that are in the paper, because some people won't have read it, which at least will put it into the frame of the discussion. But it, also because the second paper is by James Gathii, who's from Kenya, international lawyer with an amazingly wide range, teaching in Loyola, Chicago here, and he's got to talk about China and Africa from a particular perspective, and so but it makes some sense to have Rosalind's sort of China-focused perspective before his in Africa. Then third presenter this morning is Rani Mullen, who's based usually at William and Mary, but based in India, and is very much interested in India as a source of development flows now, and she'll be presenting on that, and David Malone will be commenting on that. So that's the structure of this panel, very much on the new donors, new financial sources, since some of the money is not donated at all, but commercial or quasi-commercial. We try to cover that spectrum. So that's our agenda for this panel. We then have a break, and then our last panel looks much more within the state, and that's we're going to especially focus on Brazil, other Latin American countries, public-private partnerships, cash transfers, infrastructure, and also on Indonesia. So that's our enterprise, and that'll close the close of the conference. I mentioned yesterday that we are thinking, organisers, that the quality of the papers is very high, and that it makes a lot of sense to look for a publication from this. Now we're quite excited about it, but of course it's a very rich set of ideas, and we also need a lot of thought on the marshalling of it intellectually and what exactly is the angle which is holding this all together. So we're also very much grateful for suggestions on that. Otherwise, you'll have to be stuck with what we come up with. But we'd much rather have this as a kind of wiki collaboration of what really is distinctive in this enterprise of bringing this group together. And so I invite people who have thoughts on that to tell any of us as we go along today. Okay. So with that, I'll try to launch this panel by giving a very unjust short summary of what seemed to me to be in the paper by Rosalind Shui and Michael Nelson. So their paper builds on earlier work by Rosalind Shui, her book in particular from 2011. In her book, she compares the telecommunications sector with the textile sector in China in terms of regulatory strategies and policy of the state. And the argument there is that in textiles, China has allowed relatively open entry and relatively free market-like structuring of investments, new factories, production, export, etc. in textiles. So there's regulation, but a fairly limited sort. Whereas in telecommunications, the regulatory approach in China has been much more strategic, very much aimed to assure very substantial, well-ordered development of the telecommunications sector in order to promote Chinese development, telecommunications being a key part of infrastructure for other development, to help with an industrial policy which will produce some big Chinese players within the Chinese market at least, and probably internationally, and also for reasons to do with maintaining internal stability and then the relationship of telecommunications to the flow of information. So that's her argument in that book. It's very nicely done. They build then in this paper from that to consider the telecommunications sector of the Chinese economy in Africa. And the paper looks at 2 case studies. It deals with Angola and Nigeria. And the players from the Chinese side of this, in the telecommunications sector, are the infrastructure telecommunications providers. In particular, she looks at 3, or they look at 3 of them in the state-owned structure. It's ZTE, which is a manufacturer of infrastructure and a state-owned enterprise in China, a very large world player. Secondly is this unusual arrangement of Alcatel Shanghai Bell, which is a joint venture of Alcatel, foreign corporation, with the Shanghai government. So it's a mixed private and state there, an unusual one. And third is Huawei, which is private, but as many people will know, the US Congress has said that Huawei is actually influenced by Chinese government policies. The US effectively blocked Huawei from taking over 3Com. The US, Australia has blocked Huawei from creating internet infrastructure there. India has taken some measures also, so it's private, but it's met some political resistance. Huawei denies all of that, so it's tried to show itself to be just a private sector commercial competitor. So those are 3 on the infrastructure side. There's also the operators of telecoms, in particular China Unicom and China Mobile. So they study the role of those companies and the relations of that to Chinese political and governmental economic strategy in Angola and in Nigeria. Those 2 polities and economies, of course, are very different. Nigeria is something like 160 million people, Angola about 20 million. And the model of development that they describe in Angola is one of illiberal development in the way they characterize it. That is, Angola's per capita income is over $4,000, but it seems to be heavily focused on the elite. The distribution is not highly widespread. And the telecommunications delivery, that is both mobile services and broadband internet access, has been focused mainly in the urban areas in Angola and on areas where the resources are. So in ordinary rural Angola, there's only something like 2% coverage still. Of course, in Angola, as in Nigeria and almost all of Africa, there's been an immense rise in access to telephones through the mobile revolution and in broadband internet access, although that's still only something in the area of 10% in 2010 in Angola. So in Angola had a long kind of foreign-linked civil war. China was involved in that, so there has a connection in Angola. On the other hand, it weren't particularly on the winning side there. But the Chinese presence has been there, the Benguela Railway, etc., and has built up over time, but especially since the beginning of the 2000s. The provision of telecoms in Angola, there's some large companies which are Angolan, but quite linked to the president and the president's family. And the Chinese infrastructure suppliers have been heavily involved as contractors to those. So the Nigeria situation is rather different. China has also been an important entrant into those markets, but in Nigeria, it's much poorer, but there's a higher rate, especially of rural telecommunications availability. And there already were well-established telecoms companies operating there with landlines before, and also in the mobile market, in the internet broadband market, a very substantial presence of North Atlantic companies, but also South Africa, Kuwait, and India, other substantial foreign companies already operating. So it's a much harder market to enter for the Chinese telecoms companies. So the argument of the paper, as I understand it, is broadly that to investigate the kind of key question in Western political discussion, although not necessarily key for other purposes, to what extent Chinese involvement in telecommunications is linked to Chinese interest and access to natural resources in those countries. Well, yeah, Angola is a huge supplier of oil to China, roughly comparable to Saudi Arabia, and it's the largest supplier of other countries' oil to China, something like 20 billion a year in trade, exports of Angola to China, almost all oil. And China sells things to Angola, but on a much smaller scale. So it's a huge trade imbalance in favor of Angola there. It's not a big market for Chinese products, although it's growing. Nigeria is quite different. Nigeria seems to export in 2010 under $1 billion a year of oil to China. It's not a major oil supplier to China, although of course Nigeria is a major oil producer. But on the contrary, China's sales to Angola are very large. It's a huge imbalance in favor of China. So it's a big market for China, but not so much a big source for oil. So the paper suggests that in relation to Angola, that the Chinese infrastructure companies, particularly ZTE, also to some extent maybe Huawei, but have been investing in projects which help the Angolan government, which also help ensure access to resources by providing telecommunications infrastructure to resource areas without doing very much for ordinary rural coverage, so helping the elite, helping the government, helping access to resources that is aligned with the liberal model of development as they characterize it, and that they may have taken on some projects which would have a low profitability, that is, which don't make necessarily compelling commercial sense, although they may be commercially viable, but that there's been a strategic interest for China in undertaking those projects, and particularly the case where there's a state-to-state agreement for a multiplicity of economic interactions, including sometimes resource access, as well as telecommunication supply and construction contracts, the three sort of major areas of deals of China and Angola. So the suggestion is that maybe the involvement of the Chinese companies in laying fiber optic cables and other things has commercial motives, but it's linked very much to resource access, and the structure of arrangements in Angola is a direct resource for investment swap. So there's a direct supply of oil, and in return the investments without cashing those out even. So it's a kind of a barter trade structure, the Angola model. So that's what's suggested there, and in relation to Nigeria, the picture's rather different. There are possible strategic interests of China, but they don't seem to be in access directly to natural resources, although the telecoms might help development of resources in Nigeria, but much more to do with gaining a position in the rich Nigerian market with a lot of consumers who will presumably get richer over time. But the objectives there, as also in Angola, overlap in that the Nigerian government has been able to offer internet access, mobile access to a lot of people who are voters, so it's been a source of political power and patronage through Chinese suppliers. So it's been very helpful to the government in there. China has also helped Nigeria with a satellite launch, and China bid on the Nigeria Telecoms privatization, which has been through something like 6 cycles and never actually been privatized. The Chinese bid has also failed to get the company at the end. It's still Nigerian. So overall, China seems to gain there from goodwill in Angola and in Nigeria, a goodwill in terms of being well thought of as something helping development, also potentially in political support in international organizations and things like that from both countries, and in links to the political elites in both countries. So there's a big picture gain there, but crudely speaking, not anything out of the ordinary in terms of what other countries will also be trying to do in the same kind of environments. So as I understand it, that's the big picture of this, that the telecommunications investments of China are very consistent with the strategic aspiration, that is to build strong global companies, that they make particular sense in Africa because Chinese companies offer low-cost supply, cost is an important issue for African consumers, more so than in other places. There are also markets which it's more easy to enter, which aren't already heavily saturated and highly competitive. So this idea of the sideways crab movement, that is of becoming big global companies, but through experience in building up in developing countries, seems to work well there, and it's helped ZTE, Huawei, maybe also Alcatel, Shanghai Bell. And China has specialized in the delivery of services and products which aligned to countries needing development, including, for example, low electric power usage where there's an undersupply or available electric power. So that's the big picture, and there's a geostrategic element of getting support from those states, developing links, but a resource connection only really in Angola, and it's the only place where there seems to be a departure from what you might say ordinary commercial state principles, but the overall Chinese objective of a strong global telecommunications industry built from China is being advanced there. I think that's what's in the paper. So with that, we turn to James.
I want to first start by thanking you and the organizers, David and Kevin and Davinia, for bringing us here together. I've enjoyed the conference, and I'm not sure whether I should be here, but since I'm here, I have to say something. So first, a confession. I slept late watching the basketball game last night, and I woke at 3 a.m. To watch the inauguration ceremony of the Kenyan president. I was born in Kenya, I've been following the events there very closely. And I was wondering why I was doing that, but towards the end, when President Museveni stood up to congratulate President Kenyatta, I knew that I was doing the right thing, since he said something that is directly related to what I'm going to be talking this morning. So this is the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, and since this conference is on innovation in development, I'm not sure whether this qualifies for an innovation, but this is a Chinese-funded headquarters which cost about $200 million. It's basically the tallest and, of course, best-looking building in Addis Ababa. I think it symbolizes much of what I have to say about China's interest in Africa. I think the summary that Benedict has given of the other paper already summarizes some of those motives. So I won't go into some of those because my point is a pretty narrow point. I could be done in 5 minutes, but I'll see if I can get done in 5 minutes. I doubt it. In any event, I think that China's presence in Africa raises important questions that I think need to be examined from the point of view of African governments, and really that's my optic. My optic is really an innovation that I would hope to see rather than an innovation that already exists. And perhaps it's an innovation that would replicate what China itself did and what other countries have done in the context of economies that are very rich in resources but have huge challenges in terms of their ability to participate in the global economy other than sending their minerals abroad. So this is, two other things I want to say as a footnote. One being that, this is in part an opportunity for me to be in a conversation because there's a conversation going on at the African Union level, and I've been appointed some independent expert on extractive industries. So a lot of what I've been thinking lately and what I'll be talking about are some of the ideas that we've been talking about with some of these members of the panel. We hope to come up with a report at some point in maybe 2 or 3 years. We're just at the beginning stage of that, and sort of thinking about some private law solutions or some private law suggestions that one might want to see in contracts for resource extraction, other than the Angola model for exchanging resources for infrastructural development, like this gleaming building in Addis Ababa. So everybody knows that China's presence in Africa has meant over time an increase in trade with China, but most of that trade is really focused on a few African countries, a few resource-rich African countries like Angola, of course Nigeria, the countries that have oil, Sudan. These countries are also the most unstable, these countries therefore defy one of the assumptions that we often talk about when we talk about international investment law, which is that investors often go to places that are stable, have a rule of law framework, and that have state institutions that are effective. In Africa, at least in the resource-rich African countries, that assumption is defied by the presence of huge volumes of trade between resource-seeking countries like China and those African countries. For the most part, these countries are exporting minerals, unprocessed raw minerals, nothing really more than that. And for the most part, of course, these countries are importing all sorts of Chinese goods, including textiles, all sorts of manufactured goods, mostly of low quality, although that's not my subject today, which in my view might be inconsistent with some of the proposals that I might have to say. So my basic premise is that I think these resource-rich countries could leverage their resources, in my view, to benefit from what China brings to the table. They are resource dependent and they have something to give. And in my view, so far, most of these countries have not leveraged their resources to improve outcomes for themselves in the way in which these infrastructural projects like the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, which was constructed by, believe it or not, 80% labor from China, and overwhelmingly materials mostly from China. And really this is the story in many African countries, that the deals are one-sided in more than one ways. And I think that African countries could very well take advantage of these opportunities that are presented when they exchange their resources for what China brings to the table. So my argument is that these countries, the innovation that I'd like to see is that these countries should pursue productivity-enhancing technology from China. As I'll argue in a minute or two, China did this, Japan did this with reference to China in the mid-70s, and China is doing it now with reference to Africa this decade. There's no reason African countries could not do the same. I think that there is great potential. Constructing a building like the one I showed a few minutes ago requires lots of skills, which many African firms could benefit exponentially. There are all sorts of arrangements that African governments can structure to ensure that the design of these projects, the execution of this project, by engineering firms, by architectural firms, by all sorts of service providers in these economies who in the past were unable to have the opportunity to participate in these projects, could benefit from the experience, the expertise of this of these opportunities that are presented in the economies, which would not otherwise exist. In fact, none of these resource-seeking investments would be going there were it not for these resources. These resources, in my view, are the leverage that these governments should use to get more than they're getting, especially in the Angola model, the exchange of resources for infrastructure, where the infrastructural projects are handled really from design to execution by the Chinese governments. In the brief paper that I sent that is on the website, I just say, I note that just in 2008, there were over 3,000 engineering contracts that were entered into between African governments and the Chinese, various entities from China, state-owned enterprises and others. And this is not exactly perhaps representative of the total number of projects. There could be way more because the reporting here has been very poor. The opportunities to develop the skills in science and technology for African countries, in my view, is, like I've already argued, extremely, these are valuable opportunities that should be, in my view, exploited, and which African governments are not doing so. The other thing that a lot of Chinese companies bring to the table, other than their skills, their technologies, of course, their expertise in value addition as well as their experience in accessing global market chains. Many African farms would not have the advantage of having access to those chains without the experience of Chinese farms that have done extremely well with their experience over the last several decades. And in fact, this is what President Museveni was alluding to today when, a few hours ago, when he congratulated President Uhuru. As some of you might know, I think some of the hope lies in the fact that there are new important mineral discoveries in East Africa in oil and gas, particularly in Kenya and Uganda. Uganda has been in the process of negotiating oil contracts for the last 3 years. And Uganda has not been in a hurry to conclude these negotiations. As President Museveni said, I don't actually agree with President Museveni a lot in most of my other work, but as he argued that the Western investors basically came with a very arrogant attitude, as one of my professors at Harvard once told me, the question is, how did our oil get under your soil? You know, you should give it back to us. I think is the attitude that these foreign investors went to Uganda with, and you know, President Museveni has been rightly criticized for stalling the process and for not making it very transparent. But I do believe that, unlike some of the contracts that were negotiated in other periods in Africa's relationship in the resource extraction context, I think that there is far much more information that's available to the people who are negotiating these contracts. I know some of the officers in Uganda who have been negotiating these contracts, and they're negotiating rather complex issues. I think to some extent Uganda has been able to level the playing ground in terms of negotiating on a level playing field with some of these companies. I think Uganda is preparing the way to Kenya, which has also discovered some quantities. There's questions whether they are commercially exploitable, but there is much hope that there are commercial quantities, and we shall know in a few months. So essentially, my argument here is that there are many areas in which China is involved in Africa's relationship, besides just simply taking resources out in the rail sector, in water sector, in the energy sector, and in agriculture, quite importantly. All these are areas in which China brings a lot to the table. Chinese firms could do very well by sort of collaborating in all sorts of ventures with African firms. But I think, in my view, the ball is really in the court of African governments to leverage their resources to enable this ideas to be effectuated. Now, I'm not suggesting that African leaders haven't thought about how this could happen. In fact, at the national level, in almost every country, they have what they call a Vision 2020, which unfortunately they almost look the same. And there's one section in each of these blueprints called Vision 2020, in which they talk about transforming the economies from either agrarian or resource-dependent economies to diversified economies that are engaged in manufacturing and other value addition sectors. And in Kenya in particular, the Vision 2020 has been extremely successful, at least in terms of huge infrastructural projects, which of course the turn to the east, like China and other countries, has really helped the Kenyan government to do. At the regional level, there are all sorts of initiatives, and the one I highlight here is the African Manifesto for Science, Technology, and Innovation, which actually is a multi-stakeholder initiative of academia, the civil society, as well as government. They're trying to get the buy-in of donors. At the international level, the least developed countries have what they hammered out recently, the Istanbul Plan of Action for LDCs, which also has an entire section just devoted to this idea of transforming these resource-dependent economies and diversifying them to be able to engage in manufacturing and things like that. So the ideas are there. I think that there is a renewed commitment to transform these economies, to reorient them. some suggestions from people who've been worried about some of the things that people like President Museveni have been talking about resource nationalism and sort of referring to some of what's happened in Latin America. But I think that this is really not resource nationalism. I think this is the kind of innovation that might be transformative for these economies, or at least offers transformative potential. I don't see much else that these countries have to hope for than what they really have. That's the basic point. And then on another important reason is, of course, China talks about mutual benefit, and I think that this is, and reciprocity and solidarity, I think really this has been a very effective soft power that China has used in the African context. African leaders, as I'm often reminded by my friends, like the kind of ceremonies that I watched where their egos are stroked, and one of the other things that President Museveni did today was to take a dig at the International Criminal Court. I'm sure that's what the New York Times is going to pick up. And I think that China is able to manage its affairs with African governments in a way that Western donors have not been able to because of governance issues. I certainly am not on the China side. In fact, the reason I think I'm here is because Kevin saw a piece that I'm publishing which sort of is critical of this mutual benefit idea. But if China was to live up to this idea of mutual benefit solidarity with Africans, I think these are the ideas that it should be pursuing, rather than what really has happened in the recent past, which is if you look at most of the bilateral investment treaties that China has entered into with African governments, all of them, clause by clause, line by line, look like Western bilateral investment treaties. A friend of mine at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, just presented a paper which shows line for line that China's bilateral investment treaties do not look any different like the US bilateral investment treaty model of the EU model. So I think that the ball is really in the court of African governments to respond to the opportunities that these resources present them. As I said at the beginning, I think one of the examples that African countries that are resource-rich could borrow from is the 1978 long-term agreement between China and Japan, in which essentially Japan was seeking energy security, oil from China. And in return, China sought Japan's technology. And for 8 years, this was an 8-year agreement, several contracts, thousands of contracts were signed essentially to transfer technology from Japan to China under this arrangement. This is not exactly the arrangement that African governments are arranging with China under the Angola model. So in my view, this is the innovation that I would hope to see in China-Africa trade relations. Another example of deals that have been negotiated by countries in the last several decades, like the South Koreans with the Korean high-speed rail car project, where essentially the South Koreans told the French and the British, if you want to get our multi-billion-dollar contract to build railway here, we do it 50-50. You build 50% of all the rail cars. There were like 23 rail lines to be built with rail cars, and it was the entire infrastructure outfit for the rail lines. And we do the other 50% in a joint venture. 50% can be done in Europe, but 50% has to be done in South Korea. And no wonder today South Korea is the leading exporter of things to do with rail in Asia. I think there are examples of the kinds of things that I have in mind that could be worked out in the context of resource contracts with China. And then finally, I think certainly there are challenges. Governance is certainly one of them. There's been little transparency in resource extraction contracts. Civil society groups are really shut out of the process, even with the newly discovered mineral deposits in East Africa. The civil society movement has not been able to sit at the table in both the negotiation of the deals, but more importantly also in the larger questions relating to environmental or other impacts that some of these concessions might bring. Of course, politicians want to see results in the short term. Some of the ideas I have here are ideas that only work in the long term. For example, the South Korean railcar example, it took more than 10 years for that deal to be finalized, but when it was finalized, it yielded results, I think, that were beneficial on both sides. And you know, there may be ways to get around this. This morning, again, in the inauguration ceremony, like many African leaders like to talk about, regionalism. Regional approaches are very important. I do believe that there is really some potential here and perhaps some hope that, especially in East Africa, they will have a regional approach in the mineral extraction context. And already one is seeing moves towards that in the negotiation for the oil and gas contracts for the newly discovered deposits. So thank you. Mine is really a hope for innovation rather than innovation that's already in place. And I thank you for the opportunity to share my idea with you. Thank you.
Sorry, just a second to... Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to come and share some thoughts on what India is currently doing with regard to development finance, development cooperation. And it would be great to have a discussion perhaps after our panel here on India versus China model and some differences in Africa also. I would like to just sort of as an introduction give you an overview. This is actually a slide I prepared for another conference I just came from. But why is it important to look at emerging donors such as India? And this is the overall GDP of the BRICS countries. Of course, China is in a different league, but you can see that the trend with India here in orange is also upward. Unmistakable that the economies of middle-income countries are growing and are growing rapidly in some cases. And with regard to India and the other BRIC countries, I should say, South Africa is an anomaly in that grouping. But what's interesting to see is really that over the last few years, you know, when we contrast the BRIC countries versus the G7, we look and see that 4 out of the G7 countries are now about equal or perhaps smaller in their GDPs than the BRIC countries. So there's an unmistakable trend in the economies that are growing, as well as with regard to development assistance, which is the focus of my paper here. So here I've just plotted out grants and loans and then the total being in green for the last 13, 14 years of India's development cooperation. India's development cooperation to other countries has grown rapidly, particularly during the past decade, and yet little is known about India and its development cooperation since it's not an OECD country, not a DAC country, doesn't report to DAC, and in fact doesn't report publicly on its lending at all. And yet, in 2012, the Indian government reported that about 7,000 crore rupees, which is equal to about 1.3 billion US dollars, were budgeted for development assistance for the upcoming fiscal year 2013-14. Indian development assistance budget for this past year, 2012, was comparable to Austria's foreign assistance budget for the same year, and higher than the foreign assistance of 4 of the 23 DAC countries in 2011. Moreover, the trend of India's commitments also differs markedly from those of DAC donors. As you can see here, especially in the last few years, quite a steep rise, whereas the trend has been different in the traditional donor countries. So India has experienced a 4-fold rise in the past decade in its lending, in volume, trend, purchasing power. Indian development assistance will play an increasingly important role in overall development assistance. And to just give you a little bit of a flavor for, I don't have any nice pictures, I should have thought of that. But India, for example, has financed the Afghan parliament building in Kabul. It has, in Afghanistan, financed roads and hospitals, roads and port dredging in Bangladesh, dams and hydroelectric power generation in Bhutan, balance of payments support to the Maldives, and more recently, what they have listed as development assistance, but to me looks more like quasi-military assistance to Vietnam. And then there's the whole issue there of how that ties in with China. Sorry, here, next slide. So the trend in India's development assistance budget is unmistakably going up, and if those of you who might have looked at the recently released report by DAC last week, I think it was last week, the development aid, as defined by DAC by OECD countries, fell by 4% in real terms this past year, 2% the year before. So the trends are in very different directions, although overall non-DAC donors are still a very small percentage of global development finance. So to look at India's development cooperation, India, by the way, is allergic to terms like donor and recipient. It prefers to talk about development partners, and that by itself is telling, I think. India and the BRICS countries have been often termed as new donors or emerging donors, when in fact, most of these donors are not new. They have had, in India's case, India started lending 2 years after independence in 1949. It gave grants to Burma and to Nepal when it itself was just emerging from the throes of colonialism. It then added in 1964 a program it calls iTech, which is mostly a training program, largely for foreign bureaucrats in India, but it also includes technical assistance, study abroad, tours in India, etc. From the onset of its development cooperation with other countries, the focus was on a common history and identity and an egalitarian partnership that differed remarkably in tone and in structure from foreign aid that flowed from developed to developing countries in the 1950s. And I think part of it is that I think one has to understand the historical evolution of India's development assistance program, which was born under very different circumstances than that of DAC donors. And important in trying to understand that is, for example, to look at the 1951 Colombo Plan for cooperative economic development in the South and Southeast Asia. Key there is also to understand that in this grouping, there were non-democracies represented, such as Pakistan. And so the decision was made that the cause for underdevelopment was to be found in the economic sphere, in trying to get technology and assistance, rather than, and the entire issue of political causes of underdevelopment were totally sidestepped and not mentioned. These arrangements because of the grouping of countries involved. Similarly, I think it's important to look at the 1954 Panchsheel Treaty between India and China. Of course, less than a decade later, that is undone, but in this treaty, 5 principles of peaceful coexistence are mentioned, the first one being of mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And that has really been a key part of India's foreign policy, that it keeps on focusing on this issue of focus on sovereignty. And then, of course, there's the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. So how does Indian development assistance cooperation differ? I've mentioned the different self-perception with regard to terminology of being a development partner for mutual benefit of countries, and they're trying to differentiate themselves there from traditional donors. It does not, obviously, as not being a member of the DAC group, it does not adhere to DAC standards or any other regional or global norms on what constitutes development assistance. And that, of course, then makes it difficult to compare India with other countries. The other aspect or way in which it differentiates itself, or it likes to say it differentiates itself, is that it says that its development assistance is demand-driven. And what it means by that is that when a country is interested in receiving assistance from India, it's the country that approaches the respective Indian embassy in country, and so the aid is, or the development cooperation is really framed by the country that will be receiving the cooperation. And that, again, is, as India likes to say, is quite different from what it sees as a more supply-driven development assistance focus amongst traditional donors. And I think it's important to understand that as development assistance from non-DAC donors such as India increases, and with it the options for other low-income countries to choose amongst different types of development assistance, if you're given a larger menu, is it more likely that you're going to choose the kind of aid where you can really lay out the framework yourself? Something to think about. India also likes to point out that its grants do not have conditionalities, unlike those of traditional donors. A number of studies have questioned the ability of aid conditionalities. I think that was mentioned yesterday, and this is one issue to think about in terms of how India differs. And then there is this whole issue of how does India actually organize and give development assistance? It's quite a decentralized structure within India, also then differing from most DAC donors in terms of how it formulates and manages aid. Most DAC donors, such as the US, Great Britain, France, Germany, Australia, have an independent government agency that manages foreign assistance. And even those DAC donors who do not have a separate agency, I hear that CEDA recently has done away with, or the Canadian government has done away with CEDA, and it's now part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But even they have a management structure for their development assistance that combines it within a separate department. That's not the case in India. It's still quite decentralized. In January of last year, a new structure within MEA called the Development Partnership Administration was formed, but it continues to have great difficulties coordinating and getting data even within the ministry that it's a part of. And so here, just a quick overview of the 3 different forms of development cooperation that India engages in. One are grants, which are now managed by DPA. There's still the ITAC, the training component, and then the one that I would like to focus on a little bit is what are called lines of credits. That's the latest innovation. And just to give you a little bit of a history about why this came about, faced with huge government budget constraints and huge human resource constraints. You know, the Indian entire foreign ministry has as many people employed as the country of Singapore. And on top of their various portfolios, they are charged then with not only managing all of their aspects of bilateral relationships with, say, Afghanistan, but also the development cooperation. So big constraints on the human resource side, and the desire to lend more, also with a view to China and its model of line of credits. It formed in 2004 a new instrument, as you have it in development assistance. And in this line, what's innovative about it is that because it's managed by the Export-Import Bank of India, which raises the funds for these LOCs on the international debt market, it therefore is not constrained by the Indian budget limits. And the Indian government is able to avail of greater resources in the private sector to then support its overall development partnerships in other developing countries. Here, just a quick overview of these are grants and loans of the Indian budget, and you can see over the past 13 years, a large share has gone really, the vast majority to countries in the region, Bhutan being the largest beneficiary there, but Afghanistan also has $2 billion in commitments from India, where India is the fifth largest donor in Afghanistan. Here, just a quick overview of grants and loans also, and there again you can see that the countries in the regions are the largest beneficiaries of grants. Not so the case with regard to the line of credits. And here's just, since the lines of credits were initiated, they have gone up tremendously, with the current open lines of credits touching 10 billion US dollars. This is US dollars on the side there. And because these officially the Indian government only reports that part of the interest rate which it subsidizes. So the difference between the market rate and what the government offers it at is what it reports. But when talking about Indian aid, officials talk about line of credits as one of the instruments. So you can already see that there's an issue about how should we think about these line of credits. They've increased dramatically, but question really is, should we think of them as traditional development assistance? I had quite a bit of information on how ODA deals with it, but I'm running out of time. And so just suffice it to say that this is, I think, a gray area, how they should be counted. The Indian government follows the World Bank and ODA norms in terms of determining what interest rate it offers these line of credits at. So in calculating what percentage of it is concessional, ODA says if it's 25% concessional, then it qualifies as development assistance. In fact, almost all of these are at least 25, if not significantly more. And then India has a few countries where it offers even better terms than the terms that the World Bank, for example, offers to the highly indebted poor countries. For example, a recent $1 billion line of credit to Bangladesh was offered at a 1% interest rate. And you can imagine that's highly concessional there. But the question of how we should think about it clearly meets part of it, but then ODA says, well, if it's really meant to promote domestic businesses, and if it's tied, which in fact these line of credits are, at least 75% tied to Indian domestic businesses, then it can't count as development assistance. And so this is a question of how we should think of it. If it's promoting export, which it does, it's not considered ODA, and yet India considers it part of its package, and India does not report to ODA and has no interest in reporting. And so I think this raises larger issues of these countries once, as their lending volume increases, is this really going to change the way we should think about development assistance? And one interesting thing I wanted to point out here, this is two different pie charts here. One at the beginning, when line of credits were first introduced, these line of credits that were subsidized by the government, and you can see about a third or so, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, we're going to Africa. Today, over 50% of line of credits are going to Africa. And I think what's happening there is that India is is looking at the Chinese model in Africa and modeling itself on that. It wants to be competitive. It wants to get a foothold. It's not only about resources, but also getting a foothold in the African market for building relationships up there, but it uses a somewhat different model, and we can talk about that in terms of it doesn't bring its people over to build its roads, etc. So I think, you know, what was interesting to me, I recently, when I was driving a car late at night a few days ago, heard a discussion that was taking place in Washington. There was an Exim Bank meeting. And there was a discussion about whether the US Exim Bank should revive some of its focus on promoting US businesses. And it seemed to me that the discussion was really about using Exim Bank credits to promote investments and US businesses, perhaps also in Africa. So is the entrance of China and now India into this sort of gray zone between what's development assistance, what is sort of commercial, and what are commercial endeavors, is that changing how other traditional donors are starting to view their own aid versus their commercial interests in this region? Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for two splendid presentations in person, and Benedict, to you for giving us a flavor of the presentation we missed, but with the paper available. I'm really delighted to be here today. IILJ at the NYU Law School has done an extraordinary job over the last 8, perhaps slightly more years. When you look at the productivity of this very small group, it's very impressive. But what's much more impressive is the very real and deep relationships it's established with partners in the developing world. It's very, very unusual in my experience as a former funder of development research to see this pulled off in a consistent way that has benefited all parties, I think. So many thanks to IILJ. Secondly, I bet if we took a poll, nobody much here would ever have heard of the UN University. That's partly because it's misnamed. We aren't, of course, really a university at all. We were created as the think tank of the UN. So we have about 200 researchers in 15 research centers around the world, perhaps 100 additional sort of adjunct research types, and 200 supporting colleagues. Our problems have been a lack of coherence in the research agendas across the board. So the sum total of our production not really adding up to more than, actually less than the sum of its parts. and this is something we will be, I hope, addressing in years ahead. We're headquartered in Tokyo, as Benedict mentioned, in a beautiful building, one of Tokyo's most beautiful buildings, actually, by a great Japanese architect. And so I hope we'll see some of you in years to come in Tokyo, helping us rebuild an interesting research agenda. My own recent work in research has focused on development ideas and practice, how they influence each other, the importance of each. And Kevin and Mariana, who's with us, I think, today, contributed a wonderful chapter to that endeavor, which will soon be available online as well as in a sort of rather encyclopedic OUP volume. Now, you may have covered some of the ground I'm going to cover yesterday, in which case my apologies. It's very difficult when you walk into a conference halfway through to know if you're missing the mark completely. But I did want to say that as a practitioner, but also a researcher, what struck me is the near complete disorientation of Western countries in face of actual success in the developing world, and worse, from the point of view of many of them, actual emergence of developing countries as meaningful actors economically and politically in international relations. This really cannot be understated, and we're in the midst of this process of nearly complete disorientation, which makes it a very interesting moment for IILJ and others to be working on the subject matter they are. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was living in India, as Benedict mentioned, and the Secretary General of the OECD, a very kinetic Mexican guy, Angel Gurria, who had been instrumental in many ways in liberalizing policy in his own country, came to India in order to try to convince Indian government authorities, who were pretty skeptical, that India could benefit by associating itself with the OECD. And so I offered to host a dinner for Angel with leading Indian economists, and he was happy enough with that. So he turned up with a few OECD officials of no particular account, and a number of very interesting Indians turned up, genuinely meaningful people in the country. What happened? These OECD officials of no account started lecturing their Indian counterparts of very significant account on what they should be doing and thinking. That's a measure of the disorientation, it seems to me, in the West, of which the OECD is a rather hermetic example. But one finds other examples of it across, I'd say, the spectrum of international institutional life. Bob Zoellick indulged in a provocation, in a sense, when he was a president of the World Bank, in associating himself closely with the Chinese chief economist of the bank, Justin Lin, whose central point, amongst many other interesting points, was that virtually all of the advice that the bank had preferred to China had been bad, and if it had been followed, China's development track would have been significantly less successful than it had been. But of course, Justin was essentially ignored and considered a sort of irritating outlier rather than somebody from whom something might be learned at the bank. So we have a real problem of cognitive dissonance, I'd say, in dealing with emerging reality, which is emerging at a very accelerated pace. This is part of the challenge. It's happened very quickly, and the change is continuing to accelerate rather than the other way around. So this, somewhat as introductory comments. We also see, and it's very interesting, that Western aid agencies in their relationships to their own governments in some cases, are increasingly being instrumentalized in the ways we're very excited about Chinese aid being instrumentalized, i.e. Aid in the West, in many ways now, is being pressed into the service of trade promotion objectives. That's certainly clearly the case in Canada. It's less clearly, but indubitably, the case in Britain also. In Britain, it's somewhat masked by the excellence of DFID, doubtless the best of the Western aid agencies, but the underlying objectives of the politicians who oversee DFID is in no doubt whatsoever. So in a way, the West is engaged in a race to the bottom with China, would be one way of looking at it, rather than hovering at a high moral plane above Chinese depredations. So all of this bears some further investigation, perhaps. Just a word before I get to China and India on Brazil. Brazil's in a very interesting place because if you look at the Brazilian economy and its links through trade, investment, other forms of finance to the outside world, you can argue, as the IMF research team does, that Brazil is today part of the Asian supply chain. It's as simple as that. It struggles against various distortions that being part of the Asian supply chain creates for its domestic economy. It protests that Chinese practices have distorted its own exchange rate, for example, but in fact, it seems increasingly integrated with Asia, whether it likes it or not. Meanwhile, by the way, Brazil's aid program is in a state of some disarray. It was launched with, or launched in a significant way, with great enthusiasm under Lula. Tremendous amount of energy and government support went into it. But the current president of Brazil, who is, after all, Lula's chief of staff, so she's hardly from a different party, is very skeptical of the effectiveness of Brazil's aid program in Africa. And so, as they say in Hollywood, the Brazil aid program is today in turnaround. And that's interesting to follow, because here's an emerging country come face to face with something the government thinks hasn't been working very well in the aid area. So rather than the Chinese approach, which is pretty clear, the Indian approach, which I think was very expertly described by Rani, Brazil is at a moment of reflection and redesign of its aid program. But when I was there in November, talking quite a bit about this with Brazilian friends and colleagues, nobody had a clear idea of where it would all come out. On James's terrific presentation, I think one thing that's important to notice is, to note is that while Nigeria, I think, is tremendously open to China as a trade partner, there's considerable irritation in Nigeria in political circles with China for favoring its partnership with South Africa over any form of political partnership with Nigeria. And this didn't really come up earlier, but it's actually rather relevant. The chosen partner of China in South Africa on significant geostrategic and economic issues is South Africa. So it's not BRIC plus N, it's BRICS now, and that is meaningful to Nigeria in a sense that it regrets. It sees China as being largely behind this, although that may be wrong. I think India is also very comfortable with South Africa, and probably Brazil is fairly comfortable with South Africa. And so that explains perhaps why, not so very long ago in the Financial Times, some of you will have noticed a blast from a very senior Nigerian politician on the op-ed page condemning Chinese economic colonialism in Africa. Now, these are very strong words in international financial diplomacy, so to speak. And so that really was, for those of us who think that language matters in diplomacy, an interesting interlude. Now, coming to China's aid program, it has its own limitations, obviously. It's not just this accusation of colonialism, it's also Chinese uptightness, which we saw early on in its relationship with Guinea, which the New York Times did a very good job of documenting 3 or 4 years ago. I forget exactly when it was. Guinea was one of China's early partners in Africa, and Guinea is a country that recently has been politically unstable, so changes of government. And the basic point made by the Chinese ambassador in Guinea to the New York Times, interestingly, was, we have delivered everything we promised to Guinea, and Guinea has delivered nothing to us in return. What's good about this deal for China? And that's just a microcosm of what China may encounter in Africa over time. Because when you're offering to build stadiums and build presidential palaces, you're going to be very well received. But when you expect in return some of the implementation of some of the agreements you may have reached, performance on delivery is going to vary quite a bit across Africa. So the triumphal march of China across Africa, I'm actually rather skeptical about, because I think China is going to start bumping into some of the challenges that Western aid donors experienced in Africa for a number of decades. Xu Lan, the political scientist from China who runs the public policy school at Tsinghua University, in a lecture at IDRC 3 years ago, made the point that actually China's aid program abroad is very unpopular in China. Most Chinese consider it a boondoggle and a waste of time and wonder why that money is being misallocated to aid. The population doesn't expect to come to much good, rather than being spent in other ways, perhaps on domestic priorities. So I think I'll stop there on Africa, and on India I have very little to add, but to bring in sharper relief, something that Rani made perfectly clear. India's aid program is very much tied up with its geostrategic concerns. It isn't by coincidence funding its neighbors. It's funding its neighbors along a very long common border with China, or the border of others with China. If you think of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan also has a common border with Pakistan, not coincidentally. And if you look at the figure, as she also made clear, of 1.2 billion allocated to the aid program this year, from what she said, you would have deduced that a great deal of that is for Afghanistan. And you also notice that a great deal in the aid program is for Bhutan. Why is Bhutan important? Well, a long undefined border between Bhutan and China, which is still under discussion between the two countries, buttressed by a significant Indian military presence in northern Bhutan. So much of this aid so far has been, and there's nothing wrong with that, because that's certainly the case for much Western aid as well, much of it is geostrategically dictated. I'd like to reinforce another point that Rani made, which is that the Indian model really is completely different in other developing countries beyond the neighborhood from the Chinese model. The Indian model seems to be predicated on the government working on government-to-government relationships, trying to improve them, having good bilateral ties with as many countries all over the world as possible, many of them developing countries, but then expecting the Indian private sector to do its thing. And it's largely the Indian private sector that's dealing with Africa. There isn't much suggestion that beyond broad encouragement, the Indian government is behind much of it. So it's actually a completely different model, one that I suspect on balance may work better in the long run for India than the Chinese model, which is so assertively a government-directed one, will for China. No, I think I'll stop there. The one last thing perhaps to say about India is it's interesting to watch where India puts its money multilaterally in its aid program. As you all know, and as Rani emphasized, India is a great believer in its own sovereignty and mostly in the sovereignty of other countries. And although it's very proud of its own democracy, it doesn't interfere much in terms of promoting democracy directly elsewhere, Myanmar being an example recently, which may come back to bite it in a way. Its passivity on the lack of democracy in Burma over so many years may not play so well with future Burmese governments. But that being said, that's the Indian way on democracy promotion. So what does India do to actually signal that the concept of democracy is important in its worldview? It is the first and very significant donor to the UN Democracy Fund a few years ago. So in a way, it launders its money for democracy through the UN. So no bilateral problems with anybody, and meanwhile we're sending an interesting message that democracy really does matter to us Indians. And they've added, by the way, a bit of money to that initial very significant Indian funding of the Democracy Fund. So I'll stop there. It's an endlessly interesting field, and we're just at the beginning, it seems to me. So hard and fast conclusions on all of this, and both speakers avoided hard and fast conclusions, I think rightly, we all need to be very careful about at this stage. So I'll stop there.
So thanks very much to all the speakers for this. So we invited a couple of comments, questions, etc. Probably the better be directed to the people who are actually here rather than to Rosalind, who I would like to cease trying to speak. So David first. Yes. Sorry, introduce yourselves again since people don't know.
Hi, David Gartner from Arizona State University. Thanks a lot for a really interesting set of papers on a cutting edge set of issues. So I wanted to ask whether there's a kind of missing governance dimension out there that maybe would be relevant to both of your papers. And I'm thinking really about a kind of regional governance gap, because, James, your analogy to sort of China's success, and I think back almost 20 years now, right, to the technology transfer agreements they made with multinationals like Motorola and Boeing, for that matter, and which is bearing tremendous fruit. And one of the great advantages they had is that they had a market at scale to have that kind of leverage in a way that certainly Angola doesn't, arguably even Nigeria doesn't. And so there seems to me to be a collective action problem there, a collective action problem maybe that can be solved by that gleaming building in Addis Ababa, or maybe not. But I wonder what your thoughts are on that as a sort of institutional response to this challenge. And at the same time, Rani, on the other side, my sense is that for all the potential of the G20 to, supersede the G8 on development, that hasn't yet happened yet as a collective enterprise. But I do think, as you point out, there's a lot going on among the BRICS and some other countries. And so But a lot of that, really, the interest is regional, right? The interest isn't yet global in the way that it arguably was for some of the G8. And I wonder whether there's also opportunities for regional cooperation on the development side among emerging donors that might have great significance, maybe even more significance than an unwieldy and very light touch governance process in the G20.
I think we should probably collect 2 or 3 comments if there are some, and then each of you could reply a little bit so we don't bump into the next panel too much. I think, well, lots of people want to speak. I think Matthias Goldman and then, okay, I've got it. You start.
Thank you very much. Matthias Goldman from Max Planck in Heidelberg. I've got a question for James. James, I very much like your proposals regarding technology transfer. However, I'm asking myself to what extent we don't also need to think about some economic preconditions, requirements that are necessary for that. Now, maybe I shouldn't make this comment since I'm not an economist, but I've got serious doubts whether African resource exporting countries really would benefit from foreign direct investment into technologies. I'm here thinking about the experience of Brazil. For the case of Brazil, it's been broadly and very intensively analyzed by Luis Carlos Bressa Pereira that what happened with foreign direct investment was that it simply reduced domestic savings rates. And therefore, you ended up with exactly the same technological progress and just a lot of debt instead of using your own funds. I'm not sure whether savings rates are that great in Africa, or at least in some of the emerging economies in Africa, so that you can compare it. But nevertheless, I'm asking myself, what is really the benefit of foreign direct investment? Another question that I have, or that relates to this, is what do you do about the Dutch disease? Namely, the phenomenon that resource exporting countries destroy their own or stall their own economic development because they live on the exports which they can afford with the proceeds from the resources. Now, I know that the Dutch disease has a number of monetary implications as well, and that might be very different for emerging economies as opposed to developing economies. But nevertheless, wouldn't it also be necessary, in addition to your proposals, to really think about the establishment of sovereign wealth funds or something like that for African countries to be able to benefit from that money they receive in a productive way over a long period of time? Thank you.
Well, I think I should add that this resource curse topic is Patricia Ferreira's doctoral thesis, so perhaps those who want to talk to her from Brazil, but she's focused on Africa, I might be interested in her views on that. So I think Marie van Engelhardt is next.
Yes, thanks. Marie van Engelhardt from University of Gießen. I just have a quick question to Rani. You said that India's selection of recipients is demand-driven, but to what extent is also the whole process of development cooperation demand-driven? Because if it is, then how does that correspond to what we learned yesterday, that the principle for many new donors is that aid should also be serving mutual benefits and reciprocity? Thanks.
Tim Butta.
Thanks. David pointed out specifically that Brazil's development program is really so disaggregated or fragmented that it's hard to get a sense of what exactly even is going on. My sense is that that's actually not, it may be extreme in the Brazilian case, but it's by no means unique. It seems to be a similar issue in all of the other BRICS. And I'm wondering now at the implication of it. On the one hand, one might think that this kind of institutional fragmentation, if you want, leads to just a lot of lack of coordination and probably duplicate effort and inefficiencies. On the other hand, if we are concerned, as James, for instance, pointed out, that Chinese bits look no different from Western bits, and so despite a lot of rhetoric about development partnerships, one gets that sense also from anecdotes about specific development programs that, in fact, they are not necessarily any more altruistic than ostensibly altruistic Western governmental aid programs. And so maybe it's actually a benefit that there's so much fragmentation, because then the sort of unified power of a state like China or maybe even India and Brazil can be brought to bear vis-a-vis countries that have little to offer by way of pushback. And I was wondering whether you have any indications about whether this actually has an essentially beneficial effect in terms of equalizing the power relationships in these development partnerships.
So we have Laurence Bosson and then Philip Dan. And did I miss anybody? So wave your hand vigorously. Okay, those two, and then it'll have to be pretty brief replies, otherwise the whole next session will be subsumed into this gripping topic. So Laurence.
Yeah. A short question just to complement what David has asked about in terms of governance. James, you concluded your talk with saying that the Eastern African countries should adopt, or maybe would adopt, a regional perspective in their relationship with China. And I was wondering if the reverse could be true, that China would favor a sub-regional approach in Africa. And that would be maybe, I think, less transactional political cost when negotiating with each country. And in the case of India, it's very much state-to-state driven, and I was wondering if the regional approach is part of some prospects in terms of development assistance.
Now the co-organizer, Philip Dunn.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, thank you for 4 interesting presentations. So this was actually an extremely rich panel. I have one slightly provocative question actually to James and Rani. I restricted to the two of you, trying to bring this back to the theme of our conference or workshop as large. And the question is there any innovation there in what you presented? And with respect to James, you had one slide where you had this question as, is application innovation or adaptation? And somehow I think you didn't really come out with a clear-cut answer, so just want to sort of put the question again. Is there any innovation in also the instruments that you're thinking about? And the same perhaps, again, provocatively to you, Rani, with regard to the development cooperation of India. To me, it sounds like a very traditional approach of development assistance. It's basically the trade promotion, which is basically the way, at least in Germany, development assistance has started in the 1950s as well. So it's one thing, and the other, if you look rather, it's trade promotion and it's geopolitical strategizing. So there's nothing really innovative in this. The instruments I also don't find especially sort of groundbreaking or new. And there I want to sort of ask a little deeper, sort of, if it is, as long as it is about aid to, let's say, African countries, is there any more focus, if not on ownership or the like, on results orientation or the like? So is there, in the way the development assistance in India is given, is there any sort of attempt to pick up on newer trends and make it innovative in that sense? Thanks.
So I'm sorry you have to reply much more briefly than the questions deserve, but...
Okay. So very quickly, on scale, I completely agree, and I have an entire book on African regional trade agreements addressing this idea. I think the Chinese would very well learn from the EU. The EU has basically forced African countries to negotiate what they're calling economic partnership agreements in blocks, but at the same time, and I believe that African regional economic arrangements will not exist were it not for the EU. They're basically funded by the EU for certain purposes I'm not going into right now. There is an effort right now for COMESA, East African Community, and SADC to come together. I think that there is, although this, including me, have been quite critical of these economic communities. Although there are challenges, I think there's a genuine commitment to overcome some of the collective action problems that you have suggested. But I think that these issues have to be worked out very carefully, because each of these leaders are rather temperamental when it comes to their sovereignty, to put it politely. So I mean, there are, you know, let me not go further than that, but I think that's a critical. I think the EU, though, is able to operate across many African regions by leveraging its development assistance in terms of technical assistance to these communities, and sort of basically forcing them to behave collectively rather than individually. On the economic preconditions, I completely agree. In many of these economies, low levels of educational attainment, you know, the preconditions that existed in places like Brazil and even China for the kind of industrial takeoff may not exist. But my point is pretty simple. We might have to forever postpone the idea that these economies are going to be other than primary producing economies if we were to suggest that the opportunities presented by their exploitation of their mineral resources cannot be the opportunity for them to be able to get what these economies that are interested in their minerals are bringing to the table. And I think that my sense is that although there's been a lot of rhetoric about this, is that African leaders are seriously in the new generation of trade agreement, of bilateral investment treaties. SADC, by the way, has a very important alternative BIT that's very different than the traditional Western BITs. There's a different thinking, just like Brazil, which hasn't signed any bilateral investment treaties, and the ones that it has signed, it does not implement. So there's a new sensibility about the importance of these details. South Africa is reviewing their entire BITs. So there is hope that there's a different sensibility in terms of leveraging these resources, notwithstanding all those problems, notwithstanding the Dutch disease and all the problems of the resource curse that we know are associated with resource-rich countries. In fact, my proposal is exactly to overcome that challenge. And not all economies are the same. I think you can't compare, for example, Angola and Kenya. Some of these economies that have new mineral deposits are not the same as the others. And if, with, again, going to the first point, I think there is potential for lots of capacity to cross national boundaries. Like, perfect model is Rwanda, which is borrowed lots of capacity from other countries. Finally, is there an innovation here? I think I'm pretty ambivalent as to whether there's been an innovation here. I think that the kinds of things that I'd like to see might be innovative in the African context, but they might be adaptations or replications from experience elsewhere. But I think my presentation is just to suggest the very rich potential, in my view, for alternative ways of rethinking the relationships between these countries and the countries interested in their resources. Just one other final thought, something else I'm working on as sort of at the transactional level. Another thing that I think would make a fundamental difference is sort of going to the law of contracts is clauses on third-party beneficiary rights being able to enforce obligations in light of failure of governments to be able to enforce contractual rights, especially where they violate third-party interests. I think the ground is very rich for all sorts of very creative ideas.
Thanks. Just quickly, the first question about whether G8 is still the relevant forum rather than G20. I think others, such as Jean, might be better set to answer that one, but my sense is actually that G20 really in the last years is becoming or has become the main forum. But I'm not an expert in that, and others, and perhaps David could comment on that. Regional cooperation, is Indian aid still largely regionally focused? It is in grants, but it's not exclusively and has never been. And I hope that came out in my presentation, that really, while the first loans were to neighboring, or first grants were to neighboring countries such as Nepal and Bhutan, India actually has had a relationship with many Commonwealth countries in Africa, including Kenya, that go back several decades. So it's actually not just in the region. Many of the ITEC slots actually are given, for example, to African countries, but there are also now new relationships with Pacific Island countries, for example. So not entirely just regionally focused. The question about Indian aid being demand-driven, how does that fit with the idea of mutual benefits? That idea of mutually development partnership that's mutually benefit sort of goes throughout, but it differs in how the program is put together. It's the how you sort of how it's initiated that's different. That's the demand-driven part. But there's still a thinking that it should be a process. I mean, India, after all, still is one of the poor, has the largest concentration of poor people in the world, has malnutrition rates, and there's a real issue about if you're giving money to other countries as a still developing country, the idea there that it should be of mutual benefit. And then the question of is despite all the rhetoric is Indian aid any different from traditional aid, and are there any innovations really to be thought of? And I think, you know, if we're really honest, development assistance everywhere in the world has similar goals, right? I think geostrategic, that we can't expect it not to have a commercial element. But I think what is different is that, and perhaps India is no different there than perhaps Brazil and others, is the South-South partnership view and how these come about with respect to it being initiated in the country, much less overheads, being, in many cases, India writes a blank check, which has many issues with it also, right? But nevertheless, this issue of no conditionalities, that it should be in the sovereign country's interests and power to decide how to use that money best. It brings all kinds of issues in terms of monitoring and evaluation, and how do we really judge whether they really were able to address the goals that they set out to address. So this issue of results focus. And there it's quite weak, but it has to do also with the whole way of approaching development assistance, which is much less about monitoring what the country is doing, much more a hands-off approach, but much more also an idea of equals and respecting that the other country will know what to do with it. I'm not saying it's not without its problems, I'm just saying that the approach is quite different, and I think perhaps it's in that there is innovation. I think as far as Indians are concerned, the new version of the LOC is an innovation. In fact, it might look a lot like what China has done, being applied in a slightly different context. But I also want to say that I've been quite surprised myself. I went to a post-Busan conference last year in India, and I was struck by the tone from some of the African partners who were present. For example, the Ethiopian representative there went on and on about how they've had a historically great relationship with India. India gives over 200 training slots annually to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian current president was educated in India. I think we can't underestimate that South-South sort of more level, more horizontal relationship, and how that is actually leading traditional donors to rethink their attitude, as David's example with OECD representatives. Well, if you take that kind of tone, it's not going to get you anywhere in countries like India. And I think traditional donors are starting to realize that. And for example, USAID in India is trying to figure out how to triangulate with Indian donors. That's the new buzzword in the aid world, right? Triangulate in order to figure out how to work with India in Africa, for example. Thanks.
Just a quick word then on the G8 and the G20. I think the strength of the G8 is precisely because the treasuries and central banks never accepted the participation of Russia in their discussions, that amongst the 7, there is a certain cohesion of view and value. And when the 7 decide they will act together, that packs a certain punch. The G20 lacks cohesion, particularly as there's so much Western resistance to allowing the role of the emerging countries to grow. And within the G20, there are also contradictions amongst the Western actors. When you think back a couple of years, Christine Lagarde was desperately looking to build up the IMF's financial resources to address the European crisis. Who offered money? Actually, the BRICS countries offered money. Who didn't offer money? The United States and Canada, saying the Europeans hadn't done enough to solve their own problems and didn't deserve any extra money. So there are many contradictions within the G20 forum, perhaps too many for the forum to sort of self-manage, whereas the G8, which on financial issues is really a G7, it's much easier to do business.
Well, many thanks. So we built into the program some scope for extending these sessions, so we don't have a difficulty about it, but I think we should try to start the next session at 5 after 11, and then we have through to 1 o'clock. And I should mention also that there's lunch at 1 o'clock at the end of this conference, which everyone in the room is welcome to. We have enough for everybody. It'll be in the same place. And those involved staying on for the afternoon session can, if you want, just eat lunch and stay up here. So we'll reconvene at 5 after 11.